You ever meet someone so scummy, so foul, that karma alone just doesn't cut it? Well, that's where revenge steps in, and this one, oh, it hits hard. It's about a guy who messed with the wrong woman, bragged to the wrong people, and found himself face to face with justice. Ryan, from leaked photos to beatdowns and courtroom chaos, this isn't just karma, it's a full-blown revenge epic you won't forget. The last thing I expected that day was to bump into, and I was just doing my usual shopping run, half awake and grumbling about the price of milk, when I heard someone call my name. I turned around, and there she was, grinning like no time had passed at all. We'd known each other since 6th grade. I always had this weird, flirty but never serious vibe. Back then, I secretly wanted it to be more, but life got in the way. Sophomore year, I moved out of state, and we drifted apart. I hadn't seen her in years, but seeing her again felt like picking up a conversation we never really stopped. We talked for a bit, catching up on where we'd been, what we'd done, who we'd become. Anne was still that spitfire I remembered, sharp tongue, big laugh, eyes that could light up a whole room. I gave her my number, and we promised to hang out sometime soon. It was innocent, casual, no expectations. But after I left the store, I couldn't help feeling that maybe, just maybe, life had given me a second shot at something. I didn't even know what exactly, but it felt right. We started texting that night, joking like old times, slipping back into that easy rhythm. Part of me was thrilled, part of me cautious, and had always been a bit of a wild card, and I'd learned the hard way not to expect too much out of the past. A few days later, though, the other shoe dropped. My brother James came home from work, looking pissed. He worked with this guy Dyke, a scumbag by any measure, but I didn't really know him yet. James told me how Dick had been bragging about this new girl he was seeing, saying he was basically crashing at her place until he found his own spot. Worse, he was showing James pics of her stuff that wasn't meant for anyone's eyes but his. James knew instantly who the girl was. It was The anger hit me so hard I saw red. James knew exactly how close I was to Anne, and he forwarded me the pics Dick had shown him. I didn't want to look, but I had to. It felt like a punch in the gut. There was an smiling and vulnerable, and this bastard was passing her around like a trophy while talking trash behind her back. My blood boiled. There was no way in hell I was going to let this slide. I called Anne right away, told her she needed to come over to my place as soon as possible. She heard the tone in my voice and didn't argue. She said she'd be there in 45 minutes. Those 45 minutes felt like 45 years. I paced the house, trying to calm down, but every time I pictured that smug look on Dick's face, showing off those photos, I wanted to smash something. By the time Anne walked through my door, I was practically shaking. She saw the look on my face and immediately asked what was wrong. That's when everything started. That's when the fuse got lit on this powder keg. Little did Dick know, his bragging wasn't just gone nah cost him a girlfriend, it was gone nah blow up his entire life. And I was ready to strike the match. Dick was the kind of guy you could spot from a mile away. The swagger, the cheap cologne, the loud laugh that always seemed a little forced. He worked with my brother James at the local store, and even though I hadn't met him face to face yet, the stories James brought home made my blood boil. See, Dick liked to brag about everything, especially about how clever he thought he was, how he could screw people over and come out looking like a king. But what he didn't realize was that the walls have ears, especially when you're re-bragging at work to a guy whose brother happens to be your girlfriend, his oldest friend. It started with James telling me that Dick had been going around showing off pictures of intimate stuff meant only for him. He would snicker and pass his phone around to the other guys at work, telling them how he was only with her for the free rent and how he planned to bounce as soon as he got his own place. Every word out of his mouth made my stomach turn. James, to his credit, kept his cool, playing along just enough to get the info and the pics. When James sent them to me, I felt like the ground dropped out from under me. I knew how much trust she put into people she cared about, and to see Dick treating her like trash behind her back was enough to make my vision blur with rage. James told me Dick had no shame. He'd been bragging about how Aunt cooked for him, paid some of his bills, and let him stay over almost every night. Meanwhile, he was actively hunting for other hookups, and even hinted at having a side piece already lined up. Worst of all, he had no problem sharing Anne's photos with whoever wanted to see. At first I thought maybe James was exaggerating. People talk big at work sometimes, especially the guys trying to puff up their egos. But when I saw those photos myself, there was no doubt. Dick was scum, plain and simple. Dick's cockiness didn't stop there. He'd openly talk about watching porn during his shifts when the boss wasn't looking. According to James, he'd pull out his phone, lean against the counter, and scroll through porn sites while customers were in the store. It wasn't just gross, it was reckless. But Dick didn't care. He thought he was untouchable, just skating by until he found something better. The more James told me, the more I realized Dick wasn't just some douchebag player. He was dangerous, disrespectful, and way too comfortable treating Anne like a disposable toy. That was the moment I knew I had to step in. Anne didn't deserve this. Nobody did, but especially not in someone I'd known since we were kids. Someone who deserved loyalty, love, and respect. So when I called her over that day, I wasn't just pissed, I was ready to blow this whole thing sky high. I told James to keep an ear out at work, gather whatever he could, and make sure Dick kept running his mouth. Because if he wanted to brag, find out, let him build his own gallows with his words. What Dick didn't know was that the store had high-definition security cameras pointed at the counters. After multiple robberies, the boss had upgraded the system big time, and every angle of the floor was covered. So while Dick thought he was slick, showing off explicit pics and porn on his phone at work, he was basically recording his own downfall. All I had to do was light the fuse and watch it burn. I called the boss, Ann, old friend of mine, and let her know what Dick was up to. I told her the times James had seen Dick showing off Ann's pics, told her about the porn, and told her to check the footage. I didn't lie or exaggerate. Dick had dug his own grave with his arrogance, and all I did was point someone toward the shovel. Within a day, the boss called me back. She was furious. The footage was crystal clear: Dick grinning, holding up his phone, scrolling through porn sites, and showing something to another employee while customers milled around just a few feet away. There was no excuse, no way out. Dick got called in for a meeting the next morning and came out looking pale as a ghost. 3-week suspension, massive write-up, and the threat of being fired if he so much as sneezed wrong from here on out. And that wasn't even the worst of it. Turns out the state had been investigating missing lottery tickets at the store, hundreds of dollars worth of scratchers that had vanished over the past few weeks. So now, not only was he dangling by a thread at work, he had the state breathing down his neck too. The walls were closing in, and he had no idea Anne was already done with him. The best part, I was just getting started. When Anne walked into my house that day, she looked calm, maybe even a little confused. But that changed the second I showed her those photos. Her face went pale, her jaw tightened, and her hands started shaking, not from fear, but from pure rage. I could practically see the fire in her eyes as she read the messages Dick had sent to James, bragging about using her for a place to crash and showing off her private photos like trophies. Anne was never one to take shit from anyone. But this was personal. She grabbed her phone without hesitation and dialed Dick. No hello, no pleasantries, just a cold, furious voice that demanded answers. "You think you can play me, you piece of shit?" she hissed. The venom in her voice was enough to make me step back. Dick, apparently clueless to the full extent of what she knew, tried to talk his way out of it. He stuttered, lied, tried to gaslight her, but Anne wasn't buying it for a second. For 45 minutes, she ripped into him. Every lie he tried to spin, she tore it apart. Every pathetic excuse, she threw it back in his face. She called him out on the photos, the bragging, the other women, everything. Dick had no idea how to handle a woman like Anne when she was angry. He'd thought she was naive, soft, easy to manipulate. He was wrong. She was a hurricane, and he was stuck on the phone with no place to hide. At one point I heard him trying to yell back, but she shut him down instantly. "I hope you rot." After the call, she hung up and sat there breathing hard, shaking from the adrenaline. But even through the anger, there was this steely calm under the surface. And it wasn't just lashing out she was planning. She told me she needed a few days to think, figure out exactly how to cut him out and make sure he never came crawling back. She thanked me for telling her the truth, hugged me tight, and promised Dick wasn't going to get away with this. I believed her. I'd seen an epis before, but never like this. She was ready to burn Dick's whole world down, and honestly, he deserved every second of it. Over the next few days, Dick kept trying to call her, text her, send pathetic apologies and manipulative rants, and ignored him. She was focused on getting her life in order, protecting herself, and making sure she wasn't caught off guard. She changed her locks, told her landlord about the situation, and warned friends in common not to trust anything Dick said. Meanwhile, I kept in touch with my old boss to make sure the investigation at Dick's job kept moving forward. Every day, the walls closed in a little more on Dick, and Dan was the one pulling the strings behind the scenes. She didn't cry, didn't beg for sympathy, didn't try to salvage what they had. She just got angry, got smart, and got ready. Dick thought he'd picked an easy target. Instead, he picked a woman with a backbone of steel and a whole community of people ready to back her up. It was only a matter of time before Dick found out just how badly he screwed up. And when the hammer finally came down, Anne would be holding it. When Anne hung up on Dick, the fire in her eyes hadn't faded a bit. She told me she wanted him out of her life, out of her home, out of everything. And I knew exactly how to help speed that along. See, Dick had been bragging about his filthy antics at work, thinking he was untouchable. But he forgot one crucial fact. My old boss ran that store like a tight ship, and she didn't tolerate bullshit, especially from creeps like him. I picked up the phone and called her. Even though I didn't work there anymore, we'd kept in touch. She was tough, fair, and protective of her crew, and she took customer and employee safety seriously. I told her everything: how Dick had been showing off explicit photos on the floor, talking about porn, acting like he owned the place while customers came and went right in front of him. I gave her the exact times James had seen this happen and suggested she pulled the security footage to confirm. She didn't hesitate. Less than a day later, she called me back, voice tight with barely controlled anger. The security cameras didn't lie. They had Dick on tape, leaning against the counter during his shift, pulling up those same photos on his phone, showing them to another employee. Worse, there were customers in the background, clear as day, standing just feet away while Dick treated the workplace like his own personal locker room. She was furious, not just because Dick had violated every workplace rule in the book, but because he'd put the store's reputation on the line. The state had been breathing down her neck already over missing scratch tickets, and the last thing she needed was an employee adding fuel to the fire with potential sexual harassment claims and public indecency. So she acted fast. The next morning, Dick showed up for work looking smug as ever, unaware his world was about to implode. She called him into the office, closed the door, and laid out the evidence in front of him. The look on his face apparently went from cocky to pale in seconds. He tried to deny it, but there was nothing to deny her. She hit him with a massive write-up, slapped him with a 3-week suspension, and warned him that if he so much as stepped out of line again, he'd be fired on the spot. And while he was suspended, the state investigators working the missing scratch ticket case were going to be looking closely at him, too. Turns out Dick had been sloppy there too. Inventory reports didn't match up. Footage caught him lingering suspiciously around the counter where the tickets were kept, and he'd already been questioned once before. Now, with this new complaint about him distributing explicit content at work, the investigators had even more reason to scrutinize him. James told me later that when Dick walked out of that meeting, he looked like someone had punched him in the gut. He was ranting to anyone who would listen, saying it was all a setup, claiming the cameras were lying, trying to spin some sob story about how he was being targeted unfairly, but nobody bought it. Even the guys who once laughed along with him started distancing themselves. Nobody wanted to be caught up in the fallout. The boss, meanwhile, made sure the rest of the staff knew what was up. Dick thought he was the big man on campus, but by the time the dust settled, he was nothing but a walking HR violation with a target on his back and nowhere left to hide. And this was only the beginning. Anne was done playing defense now. It was time to make sure Dick felt every ounce of pain he'd put into the world, and then some. Dick didn't take Anne dumping him. Well, at first he blew up her phone with calls, messages, voicemails, all of them alternating between begging and threatening. One minute he was promising he'd change, the next he was cussing her out, saying she'd regret crossing him. But Anne wasn't scared, she was angry. Still, I could tell it was starting to wear on her, getting dozens of calls a day from a man who, just been caught bragging about using her while also throwing threats at her door, would shake anyone up. That's when I called Pops. My dad had been around the block more times than I could count. He owned the local transport company, cabs, limos, shuttle buses, you name it, and everyone in town knew him. Pops was the kind of guy you didn't mess with. 6'6", 300+ pounds, and built like he was carved out of granite. But beyond that, he was fiercely protective of the people he loved. And he loved Anne like she was one of his own. I told him everything about Dick, the threats, the pictures, the way he was stalking Anne. Pops didn't say much on the phone. He just grunted and told me to swing by the station that night to talk. When I got there, he already had a plan brewing. Most of the drivers knew Anne. She'd ridden with him dozens of times, sometimes just hanging out at the station when she was bored. They all liked her, and more importantly, they all hated bullies. Pops wanted to make sure Dick couldn't get near her without going through us first. It didn't take long before Dick made his next move. He called the cab company, same as he always did, trying to book a ride to Anne's place. He'd done it 100 times before. Easy way to roll up looking casual, like he wasn't stalking her, even though that's exactly what he was doing. I found her sitting at my desk, going over paperwork for a job Pops was going to offer her. She looked up at me with those fierce eyes and asked if he was here. I nodded. Pops came out of the back, took one look at the cab, and went over to his computer. He had a remote control for the cab's electrical system security measure. D added years ago after a driver got assaulted by a drunk passenger. He flipped the switch, and just like that, Dick was stuck. I went back out and told Dick there was a problem with the cab, that he'd need to come inside and wait while we sorted it out. He cursed under his breath but followed me in. The second he stepped inside and saw Anne sitting there, with a dozen roses on the desk and a card that said, "Love you," he lost it. He started screaming at Anne, calling her every name in the book, accusing her of cheating Anne, though they were done. And he was the one who'd been bragging about sleeping around. Then he lunged at her. It happened too fast for Dick to realize what a mistake he'd made. He screamed, cursed, called us every name in the book, but nobody cared. We just waited. The cops showed up 20 minutes later, laughing when they saw who it was. In a small town, word travels fast. Most of the local force knew Pops, respected him, and they didn't exactly rush to preserve the security footage of Dick getting tied up and soaked. Funny how that works. They arrested Dick for assault, took him in, and lost the tape later that night, and I pressed charges immediately, and Pops filed a trespassing complaint. Dick thought he could bully his way through life, threaten people, and get his way. But he ran into the wrong family, one that protects their own, one that doesn't back down, one that knows how to handle scumbags like him. And this was just the start of Dick's problems. Jail was waiting, and we were waiting to watch karma do its thing. Dick had no idea. He was walking right into the lioness stand when he climbed into that cab. He'd been calling the company for weeks, trying to keep tabs on him, showing up at a place unannounced, hoping to guilt or intimidate her into taking him back. But this time, the cab wasn't just any driver, it was me behind the wheel. And the plan was already set in motion. As we pulled away from his pickup spot, Dick was on his phone, pacing through screens like he was trying to find his next mark. He barely glanced up when I told him we had to make a quick stop at the station. Standard procedure. I said, had to grab paperwork. He grunted something that sounded like fine and kept scrolling. I could feel the tension in my chest as we rolled up to the station. Inside, Anne was waiting at my desk with Pops. The Godfather leaned against the wall, arms crossed, the kind of quiet mountain you just didn't mess with. Pops had already shut down the car's engine remotely, so Dick had nowhere to go. I walked in first, gave the signal. Then I came back out, put on my best fake grin, and said, "Hey man, come inside real quick while we fix the cab. Shouldn't take more than a minute." Dick sighed dramatically, like the world was inconveniencing him, and followed me in. The second he walked through the door, he saw Anne sitting there, calm but icy, with those roses on the desks, the same ones I'd bought for my grandma. The card said, "Love you," and Dick's brain just snapped. He started screaming, calling in every name he could think of, accusing her of cheating, demanding to know who the roses were from. He lunged across the room so fast it looked like a horror movie jump scare. But Pops was ready. He stepped between them and caught Dick mid-lunge, one massive hand grabbing the front of Dick's shirt, the other pinning him by the throat against the wall. Dick flailed and cursed, trying to claw at Pops, but it was like watching a chihuahua try to fight a bear. "Tatter again," Pops rumbled, his voice low and lethal, "and you'll be picking your teeth out of the gravel." The Godfather came up behind him, yanked him away from the wall, and dragged him outside like yesterday's trash. He tied him to the pole out front with a heavy strap, while Dick screamed about calling the cops, calling lawyers, calling whoever he thought would save him. Nobody moved. Then I turned on the sprinklers. The look on Dick's face when the cold water hit him was priceless. Shock, rage, confusion, then pure humiliation. He struggled against the strop, cursing so loud the neighbors probably heard, but none of us cared. Inside, Anne was watching through the window, arms crossed, a tiny satisfied smirk on her lips. 15 minutes later, the cops pulled up to officers who knew Pops well. They stepped out, took one look at Dick, and just shook their heads. One of them said, "So, what's the charge this time?" while the others started laughing. We explained the situation. Dick had lunged at her and a mute had threatened her, and we weren't about to let him walk out free. They cuffed him, cut him loose from the pole, and hauled him off, still dripping wet and shrieking about lawsuits. Funny enough, the security footage from the station of Dick lunging at an Pops pinning him and the Godfather dragging him out disappeared from the evidence locker. Nobody asked too many questions. In a small town, certain people earned respect, and Pops was one of those people. Dick spent the night in the drunk tank, and Ann pressed charges first thing the next morning. Pops backed her up with a trespassing complaint, and the station filed an official report about Dick threatening staff. He tried to spin it later, saying we'd set him up, but nobody believed him, especially since half the town already knew how he'd been bragging about using it, showing her pics around like a trophy. By the time Dick got out on bond, he was facing charges for assault, harassment, and trespassing, and had a restraining order slapped on him so fast his head spun. He called the cab company a few days later to try to get a ride to court. Pops picked up the line, smirked, and booked him one last ride. That day, we made sure the driver took every flooded, pothole-ridden road in town. Dick was 45 minutes late to his hearing, soaking wet from the rain, and the judge had no patience for his excuses. That was the beginning of the end for Dick. But at the station, we were just sitting back, watching Karma do what Karma does best. The image of Dick tied to that pole, soaked to the bone under the freezing sprinklers, is one I'll carry with me to the grave. It wasn't just satisfying, it was necessary. For weeks this punk had terrorized and bragged about using her, treated her like garbage, and threatened her when she finally kicked him out. Now, he was the one stuck in place, sputtering and cursing, completely powerless as the cold water blasted him again and again. We didn't say much as we watched him struggle. Anne stood inside the station, arms crossed, face hard as stone. Pops just leaned against the doorframe, expression neutral, but there was a glint in his eye, just silent warning that he'd do it again in a heartbeat if Dick tried anything stupid. Dick screamed about calling the cops, threatened lawsuits, wind that we'd assaulted him, but none of us flinched. The Godfather just chuckled and said, "B is da baby cold. Maybe you shouldn't go grabbing women by the neck, Yamora." Eventually, the patrol car rolled up, lights flashing, wipers on full blast against the drizzle. 2 local officers stepped out, looking more amused than concerned. These were guys who'd known Pops for years, probably shared beers with him at the local bar more than once. They didn't exactly rush to free Dick from the pole while we got here. One of them asked, already smirking as he took in Dick's soaked, red-faced rage. Pops shrugged. Guy came in, lunged at my employee. We put him outside so he wouldn't hurt nobody else. "You want him? He's all yours." The second officer, trying not to laugh, asked Dick if he wanted to press charges. Dick sputtered, screaming about how we'd tied him up and tortured him. The officers exchanged a look, then one said flatly, "Yeah, sounds like you maybe should have just left her alone in the first place." But they cut him loose, cuffed him, and put him in the back of a squad car, still dripping wet and fuming. The Godfather leaned over and whispered loud enough for Dick to hear, "Say hi to Big Mike for us." Dick went pale, because Big Mike was a local legend, a guy doing time for beating the crap out of woman beaters and creeps. As they drove off and let out a shaky breath, Pops patted her on the shoulder, rough but gentle, and told her she was safe now. The footage of Dick getting taken down, tied up, and hosed off was on the station's security system. But somehow, it never made it to the police evidence locker. Accidents happen, especially in small towns where certain people have friends in the right places. The next day, Dick tried to file a complaint, swearing up and down we'd assaulted him, but it went nowhere. The cops couldn't find the tape, and every officer who showed up that night backed Pop's version of the story. Dick came in aggressive, lunged at an eye, and got restrained until help arrived. Simple as that. Word spread fast around town. People who once thought Dick was just a loudmouth started seeing him for what he was, a creep and a bully who finally picked on the wrong family. His suspension at work turned into a full-on investigation. Once the boss heard about the assault charge, and an arm, meanwhile, was given a job at the transport company by Pop, surrounded by people who cared about her, and out of Dick's reach for good. It wasn't some grand act of vengeance that landed Dick in jail. It was his own damn mouth, his own damn hands, and his own damn arrogance. We just made sure he didn't get to hurting again in the meantime. Some folks called it street justice. Some called it small-town loyalty. Me, I called it karma with a personal touch. And watching Dick dragged away in cuffs, dripping wet and screaming, was the moment I knew he'd done the right thing. The rest of his downfall was coming slow. We gave karma a little helping hand. Dick thought he was slick. He really believed he'd charm the court, twist the story, and walk out clean. But the universe had other plans. The morning of his hearing, he called Pop's cab company, whining about needing a ride to court because it was storming outside. I almost laughed out loud when Pops handed the call off to one of our drivers with instructions to take your time. That morning the roads were flooded, rain coming down in sheets, fog so thick you couldn't see past the hood of the car. The driver crawled along at 10 miles an hour, taking the longest route possible. Meanwhile, Dick stood in the back, getting more anxious by the minute, cursing the driver under his breath and trying to call the courthouse to tell them he was on his way. But nobody picked up. By the time he finally arrived, he was 45 minutes late. The judge wasn't impressed. In fact, the judge held him in contempt right off the bat for disrespecting the court's time. And that was before they even got into the real charges: assault, trespassing, and, to top it off, possession. Turns out Dick had been carrying coke on him the night he went after him. The cops didn't find it right away, probably because he de-stuffed it in his boot, but by the time they processed him, they found the baggie and added the charge. Now, the judge had everything: the assault, the threats, the trespassing, and a drug charge. Dick tried to play the victim, spinning a sob story about how he was set up, how Ann and I were conspiring against him. He even tried blaming the coke on me, saying I planted it to make him look bad. But the judge wasn't buying it. The courtroom was small. Everyone knew everyone, and the judge had heard about Dick's mouth around town. Finally, the judge laid it out: 10 years behind bars, reduced to 5, if Dick gave up his dealer. Dick cracked almost immediately. He spilled everything, flipping on his guy in less than a minute. But that didn't save him from prison. It just shaved a few years off the sentence. As they led Dick away, he looked back at me like he wanted to spit venom. But I just smiled, gave him a little wave, and said, "Say hi to Big Mike for me." Dick paled instantly. That was the last time I saw him free. From what my buddy in the county jail told me, Dick didn't last long before he got beat so badly he spent 2 weeks in the infirmary. And every time he tried to mouth off, someone put him back in his place. Courtroom karma is slow, but it hits hard. Dick thought he was untouchable. Turns out, the town had other plans. Dick had always been the loudest guy in the room, the one who bragged about using women, who puffed out his chest and talked tough, who thought he was untouchable because he could sweet talk or bully his way out of any situation. But prison doesn't care how big you talk. In prison, everyone's heard that shit before, and nobody's impressed. My buddy works as a guard at the state pen, and he told me exactly how Dick's first week went. They put him in a cell with Big Mike, a guy doing 24 aggravated assault, a giant who had one golden rule: if you laid a hand on a woman or kid, he'd make your life hell. Dick didn't know that, of course. He strutted in like he owned the place, tried to run his mouth about how unfair the system was, how he got set up. Big Mike just watched him with dead eyes, didn't say a word. That first night, Dick tried to push his luck, complaining about the food, mouthing off at the guards, acting like he was better than everyone else. Big Mike waited until lights out before he moved. He beat Dick so bad the next morning they had to haul him to the infirmary: broken ribs, swollen face, stitches in 3 different places. The official report said fight over cards, but everyone knew exactly why Big Mike did it. Word had already gotten around about why Dick was inside. See, news travels fast in prison. The guards talk, inmates talk, and everyone loves fresh meat gossip. By the end of that first week, Dick was branded the creep who beat women, the guy who got tied to a pole and soaked by a bunch of cabbies. In prison, that's blood in the water. The tough guys smelled weakness and hypocrisy, and they made him pay. The guards kept putting Dick on the worst details: cleaning toilets in the solitary wing, scrubbing the yard when it rained, hauling garbage to the dumpsters in the middle of the night. Anytime there was a 2-man job that nobody wanted, they sent Dick to do it alone. Every day he was getting shoved, tripped, mocked, and sometimes outright punched just for being there. My buddy told me that Dick tried to go to protective custody, claiming his life was in danger. The warden laughed in his face unless Dick was willing to snitch on bigger fish. He was staying right where he was. The guy who spent months bragging about using Ain like a doormat was now getting used like one himself, day in and day out. And Big Mike wasn't done. Every time Dick started talking slick again, Mike would remind him with a backhand or a fist to the ribs that there was no respect here, no pity, no second chances. Dick learned to shut his mouth, to keep his head down, to take orders and do the dirtiest work without complaint. In the yard, they called him the yard bitch. He was the one who carried mop buckets, cleaned up after fights, swept up after the kitchen detail left scraps. He tried to make friends early on, tried to find someone to protect him, but nobody wanted anything to do with him. He was radioactive, marked by guards as a snitch, and mocked by inmates as the lowest scum for what he did on the outside. When the guards needed a laugh, they'd throw Dick out on trash duty in the rain or make him work double shift scrubbing the laundry. When Big Mike was in a bad mood, Dick felt it first. When the new inmates arrived, Dick was the one forced to show them the ropes while they mocked him the whole time. My buddy said Dick aged 10 years in his first 6 months. His hair started falling out. He lost weight, and that cocky spark in his eyes was gone. He looked over his shoulder constantly, flinched when anyone moved too fast, and barely spoke above a whisper. Prison didn't break everyone, but it broke Dick. He learned exactly what it felt like to be powerless, to be used, to have no way out. And the best part, he deserved every second of it. Every time I think back on those days on sitting in my house, eyes blazing, Dick tied to that pole screaming like a wet katai. And sometimes, it takes 5 years behind bars, with men who hate everything you stand for. Dick wanted to play a tough guy, wanted to brag about how he could do whatever he wanted and walk away clean. But he ended up exactly where he belonged, getting beat, humiliated, and stripped of every ounce of power he thought he had. That's the thing about revenge, it doesn't stop when the cops come, or the judge hands down the sentence. Sometimes, the universe keeps grinding the bastard down, day after day, until there's nothing left but regret and pain. And Dickie earned every minute of it. So what's the moral of this whole mess? Simple: treat people like dirt, and eventually you'll eat it. Dick thought he was invincible, bragging, threatening, using people like stepping stones. But karma came for him with fists, prison bars, and a whole town ready to watch him fall. And found her peace. We found our justice. And Dick found out exactly how small and weak he really was. Remember, karma's a bitch, but revenge is a bigger bitch. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe for more tales of payback, and remember, some people only learn the hard way.